So we will get started with They Never Made It Home, Civil War Disaster on the Mississippi. About our speaker today, after a long career as a corporate executive, Julie Adamik embarked on a journey to discover her roots. Using brief handwritten notes found among her father's papers after he passed away, she set out to learn more about the ancestors whose DNA she shares. She became intrigued by the advances in DNA technology and its use in genealogy research. Ms. Adamik has attended several genealogy courses, including the Genealogy Research Institute program on practical genetic genealogy. She's also completed two 13-week programs on British genealogical research through the Society of Genealogists in London. Prior to becoming a self-professed genealogy addict, Ms. Adamik spent 45 years as a corporate human resources executive. She has a Bachelor of Science in Business from San Diego State University. She's a past president of NSDCGS and a member of the National Genealogical Society, Illinois Genealogical Society, Peoria County Genealogical Society, Tazewell County Genealogical Society, Society of Genealogists, and the Irish Genealogical Research Society. This is what happens when you have access to all of these via the pandemic. When not spending time, often late into the night, pulling her hair out trying to find her great-grandfather's biological father, Ms. Adamik enjoys traveling, gardening, and cooking, anything to allow the bruise on her head to heal after banging it against a brick wall so many times. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julie. If you are all set, Julie.
I am. Okay, so you should see my presentation slide view. Is that correct, Stacy?
We are good to go. The time is all yours.
Excellent. Okay, good morning, everyone. My presentation this morning is not just about my great-great-grandfather, Lucius Remington, but it's also the story of the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history, one that sadly most Americans have never even heard of. This wasn't just a normal shipwreck on the Mississippi, which is pretty common occurrence in the days of steamboats. This was much, much worse. In fact, it was so horrible as I learned about it and researched about it that I even today sometimes struggle to get my head around it. I could probably spend all day just talking about this one event, but instead I'll try to condense it into about 25 minutes. So imagine, if you will, it's the spring of 1865. This is a dark time in American history, as you all know. And I think the author, Jerry Potter, sums it up quite well in the foreword that he wrote in Gene Saliker's book, Disaster on the Mississippi. For 4 long and bloody years, war had raged across America. Finally, on April 9, 1865, the guns fell silent. The South was defeated. It ended when the tattered army of Northern Virginia surrendered at Appomattox, Appomattox. America had paid a horrible price during the Civil War. Her soil lay stained by the blood of more than 600,000 of her sons. After listening to my presentation today, you may find this story as intriguing as I did. If so, I highly recommend you read both this book, Disaster on the Mississippi by Gene, and also Jerry Potter's book, The Sultana Tragedy. And I'm sure, like myself, you will become enthralled by this story. So a couple of years earlier, in June 1863, Lucius Remington was required to register for the draft. He was 43 years old. Considering the life expectancy of a man in 1860 was only about 40 years, this would be like an 80-year-old going to war today. So think about it, he was quite old at the time to be drafted. At this time, Lucius was a farmer living in Holmes County, Ohio, with his wife Elizabeth and their 4 children. Mary Alice, the youngest, would grow up to become my great-grandmother. Interestingly, I was able to locate their farm by putting together a historic map of Holmes County and the 1860 census. It's just one of the tricks I learned from some of our society presentations. And hold on a second here. Okay. So if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see where, using this historical map, I was able to plot out all the names on the 1860 census that surrounded where Lucius and his family lived. So you had in the enumerated residence 446, you had the Heights, you had another Heights in 445, and so on. And then you've got Crawford in enumeration residence 450, and another Crawford in 449. Well, the Crawford that lived in plot 449 was quite elderly. So it's highly likely that he hired Lucius to farm that small square of land that I have highlighted in green here, because the Remington family fell right between the Crawford and the Biggs family on that map. So I was quite excited when I was able to uncover the exact location. And I can't wait to get back to Ohio so I could check this out further. I would love to actually visit that area and see where they lived. 8 months after registering for the draft in February of 1864, Lucius is mustered into Company G of the 102nd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He's then sent to Camp Mansfield in Mansfield, Ohio, for some initial training. After just 7 months in the Army, he actually saw action at the Battle of Athens, Georgia. And this is a quite interesting battle to read about. There's lots of information on the internet. It was the fall of 1864, and the Union troops had advanced into the Confederate territory, including Alabama. Food, ammunition, clothing, and weapons were needed to support this campaign, and these supplies were transported by the Alabama and Tennessee Railroad. There was a train trestle over the Sulphur Creek, which was obviously a vulnerable strategic site. And you can see the background of this slide is a drawing of the Sulphur Creek trestle. There was a rudimentary fort that was built to defend this against damage by the rebel forces. It was just a small fort. It measured only 300 by 300 feet. Inside the fort, 24-year-old Colonel Wallace Campbell of the Union Army and his troops were waiting for additional soldiers from the 102nd Ohio and the 18th Michigan, who were supposed to be on their way to help them defend the fort. As they were holding down the fort, waiting for these reinforcements, a quite famous rebel general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was able to convince Campbell that the Confederate troops numbered at least 10,000 men that were going to attack the fort. In reality, Forrest only had about 4,000 to 4,500 troops. It's just fascinating. There's a couple of different accounts of what transpired. I've read both the Confederate view and the Union view. And Forrest was able to trick Colonel Campbell into thinking that there were far greater troops than he really had. And he did this by having his men mount their horses, dismount, remount. He moved the men from place to place throughout the day and night, and then he built campfires all across the countryside just to make it appear that his number of men was huge, when in reality it wasn't. You have to admit, quite a clever gentleman. Upon seeing this, Colonel Campbell panics and decides that they are clearly outnumbered. He lowers the fort's flag and surrenders the fort and his garrison. Shortly after doing this, Lucius Remington, along with 150 other men of the 102nd Ohio, show up at the fort. After about 3 hours of trying to fight off the rebels and the loss of about a third of their men, the 102nd surrenders. These troops are sent as prisoners to Cahaba Prison in Alabama. Cahaba Prison was also known as Castle Morgan. It was an unfinished former cotton warehouse located on the west bank of the Alabama River. The roof was unfinished, and this left about 1,600 square feet in the center that was exposed to the elements. The rebels had built 250 bunks and kind of just stacked them one on top of the other, so it was pretty cramped. But by the time Lucius got there in October of 1864, there were over 2,000 prisoners in this camp, and still only 250 bunks. So that meant that most men had to sleep on the dirt out in the open in the elements. And if you can see from the pictures here, these are the top one is the actual picture of a building at Cahaba Prison. And then the bottom is a drawing of the prison, so you can see how it was open in so many spots, and it ran right next to the Alabama River. Among other things, the polluted water supply was a severe health concern. An artesian well ran about 200 yards through the town before it got to the fort, or excuse me, the prison, and then ran diagonally across the prison grounds. And you can see from the illustration on the left, that diagonal trough that is shown there is the artesian well that I'm speaking of. It cuts right across the prison yard, and the water in this trough was used for bathing by not only the inmates of the prison, but also the citizens of the town. Remember, it ran 300 or 200 yards through the town before it even got to the prison. It was also the disposal site for buckets, tubs, and spittoons from stores, offices, and even the hospital in town. Then you had the waste from farm animals, such as hogs and cows and dogs and whatever, also flowed into this trough, along with all sorts of filth from the streets and other sources. So you can imagine how polluted that water was by the time it got into the prison. And this was the only water source that these prisoners had to drink. The flea infestation was obviously a major concern, as was the rat population. However, the rat population was kept under control because they provided one of the only sources of protein for these men. Nonetheless, nothing compared to the lice. As one prisoner stated after his first night at Cahaba, I was so covered with lice that my clothes looked more like pepper and salt than blue. Lice crawled upon our clothing by day, crawled over our bodies, into our ears, even into the mouths, the nostrils and mouths by night. And it's hard to imagine any worse conditions for these prisoners than their stay at Cahaba. Currently, only the brick fireplace that you see in the picture on the right is the only thing that remains of the prison camp, and it is a national park site currently, and it does have some interesting tributes and memorials to the men who were prisoners of war there. In March 1865, the Alabama River overflowed and completely flooded the prison. Prisoners were forced to stand in waist-high water for 5 days. Things could not get much worse. Every time I think about my great-great-grandfather living under these conditions, it just makes me want to cry. Fortunately, Lucius was subjected to the horrors of Cahaba for only about 5.5 months when the war ended. He and his fellow prisoners were taken from Cahaba to Camp Fisk near Vicksburg, Alabama, for the official exchange and release from their Confederate captors. And on the map here, you can see how the red dot shows where they were captured at the Battle of Athens, and then taken to Cahaba Prison, where you see the blue dot, and then over to Vicksburg to finally be released and sent home. The picture in the lower right is the actual photograph of the exchange. So you had the Union officers on the left and the Confederate officer on the right. Once released from Camp Fisk, soldiers were then put onto steamboats for a trip up the Mississippi towards home. And you can see the green line here going up the Mississippi to Cairo. And of course, for most of these guys who were in the 102nd Ohio, they were going to then move from Cairo, Illinois, onto another boat and continue on the Ohio River to Columbus. One of those steamboats that were used to transport prisoners was the Sultana. The Sultana was launched in January of 1863, so she was a fairly new boat in 1865. She measured 260 feet long and 42 feet wide. Not huge by any stretch of the imagination. But at the time, she was a state-of-the-art vessel, and she had a legal carrying capacity of 376 passengers and 84 crew. But when they were loading the soldiers for their trip home, things didn't go exactly as planned. The government had decided to pay $5 per soldier and $10 per officer to the steamboat captains to transport these soldiers from Vicksburg, Alabama to Cairo, Illinois. But if you think about it, in 1865, this was a huge amount of money. The captain and part owner of the Sultana, a gentleman by the name of J. Cass Mason, was in serious financial difficulties. He was quite motivated to get as many men as possible onto his boat. He offered a kickback to Army officers to ensure the maximum number of passengers would be put on his vessel. The process of assigning and loading the boats was rife with corruption, bribery, and greed, to say the least. If you read the accounts, government accounts, and the transcriptions from the investigation, there was also a tremendous amount of incompetence at the time on the part of several individuals involved in this. Prior to the departure of the Sultana, there were other steamboats at Vicksburg that left either empty or only with a handful of passengers. What had happened was there were two different steamboat lines, and only one of them was, quote, contracted with the government to transport these prisoners. And of course, that line was the line that the Sultana was a part of, and Captain Mason was going to make sure that as many bodies as he could get on his boat was going to go on the Sultana, and did everything he could to make sure that no one was put on board these other boats from a competing steamboat line. And these boats just said, well, we're leaving, and they left with just a few passengers. The Sultana, as I said before, had a legal capacity of 460 passenger crew. She was subsequently loaded with 2,137 people. Most of these people were prisoners of war from Tennessee, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan. This picture that I'm showing you right here, this is an actual photograph that was taken at Helena, Arkansas. The men on board were so excited when they saw somebody setting up a camera on shore. Remember, photographs was still quite a novelty, that they rushed to the side of the boat, nearly capsizing it. This is the very last picture ever taken of the Sultana and its passengers. But all was not well with the Sultana. One of her boilers had sprung a leak, and Captain Mason, unwilling to accept a delay, decided that instead of having it properly prepared, he could just have it patched. So he had it patched. The boiler continued to create problems for the captain and his engineers, and ended up having another repair done at Memphis. Now, you have to keep in mind that at this time, the Mississippi River was severely flooded due to spring rains. In some parts, it was as wide as 5 miles. The current was extremely strong and fast. When they docked in Memphis, much of the cargo was unloaded. This made the boat even more top-heavy than it had been when it started out at Vicksburg. Fighting that strong current put even more strain on the already damaged boilers. It's probably not hard to imagine the joy, excitement, smiles, shouts, exhilaration that these men felt as they boarded the steamboat and rested on the decks of the Sultana. I'm sure they were all thinking about how good it would finally be to get home to their loved ones, thrilled that the war was finally over. That feeling was short-lived. 7 miles north of Memphis at 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, the Sultana exploded. Over 1,000 former prisoners of war who had just recently been released from notoriously cruel prisons at Andersonville and Cahaba were killed. It's so heartbreaking to think that because of corruption and greed, these men died after surviving the atrocities of a Civil War prison camp. By now, most of you are probably thinking, how come I've never heard of this? Why did the Sultana disaster just end up as an obscure footnote in history? I know up until about a year ago, actually just before the pandemic, was the first time that I heard about it. The country had just lived through a massively bloody civil war. Thousands upon thousands of men were killed and maimed, battle after battle. 4 years of this and another 1,000 soldiers dying just wasn't front page news. Bigger news was that the war was over. Lee had surrendered. A few days after that, President Lincoln is assassinated. Then, a few days later, his assassin is captured and killed. There was a lot going on in April of 1865 that was much more newsworthy than the Sultana. Also keep in mind, in those days, news traveled slowly. So by the time the Sultana headed towards Memphis, people were just learning about the president being shot, about the capture of his killer. The newspapers were full of headlines of major recent events, and the Sultana was sadly relegated to the back pages. And it stayed there for quite a while. While the incident was immediately investigated, reading through the transcripts and the documentation of what occurred leading up to the Sultana disaster just makes you shake your head. The people involved in the decisions, those involved in the bribery scheme, the general incompetence that occurred was overwhelming. Yet no one was really ever held accountable except for one person, Captain Frederick Speed. And he was court-martialed, and that was the extent of his punishment. So one can speculate that because Army officers at quite high levels were involved in this bribery scheme, that there might have been a little government cover-up going on at the same time, and that could be a contributing factor as to why the Sultana isn't well known even today. It's almost like it was kind of downplayed and swept under the rug a bit. So what happened to Lucius Remington? Well, that's a very good question. Up until just a couple of weeks ago, my research pointed in the direction that he was on board the Sultana and survived the explosion. However, about a week or so ago, or actually a couple of weeks ago, some additional research and some contacts that I made now makes me a little less sure that that's what happened. So let's take a look at what I know. I know he was a prisoner of Cahaba. That's clearly documented by very credible sources. I know he was exchanged at Vicksburg. Again, I have actual government documents and several testimonies that say that confirm this. He was listed as a passenger on the Sultana on some lists, but not on others. And this becomes important in a second. I'll explain why. At first, I thought he maybe went on the Henry Ames or the Olive Branch, who were also steamships from the same steamship line as the Sultana, and they left Vicksburg about the same time as the Sultana. But after doing some research, I found out that there were no members of the Ohio 102nd on either of those boats, so he wasn't there. I do know for a fact, based on several credible documents, that he died at the U.S. General Hospital in Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, which is just outside St. Louis. He died in June of 1865, so just a few weeks after the Sultana exploded. And his pension records that were filed by his widow state that he died of an illness which was contracted while a prisoner. So again, kind of scratch my head. Well, was he on the Sultana or wasn't he? How did he get from Vicksburg to St. Louis? I do know that there were some men in a hospital at Vicksburg, and it's possible that Lucius might have been among them. In fact, yesterday, I just discovered a document written by another member of the 102nd Ohio, Company G, same company that Lucius was in, who states that he was very sick at Vicksburg and spent several days there, later going on to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. He then states that he was released from the General Hospital at Jefferson Barracks before heading home. Aha, it's possible that Lucius may have been with him and spent extra time in Vicksburg before heading to St. Louis. I was able to get the name of the individual who was a descendant of this person. And I haven't yet begun, but I will start cyber stalking him to see if I can find out some more information about his ancestor and whether or not there might be some mention of Lucius. His ancestor did have a diary, so fingers crossed I can get a hold of this guy and find out more information. So while I don't have all the answers about what happened to my great-great-grandfather, Lucius Remington, I'll continue to unravel the contradictions I keep finding in documents, and I'll try to put together the puzzle pieces. In the meantime, I think the story of the Sultana disaster is one that still needs to be told. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. If you have any questions, we'll go ahead and open up for questions at this time. Julie, did you want to be on camera for questions?
If I can figure out how to do that, yes. Am I
I will
on?
join you.
Can you see me?
I can see you. You're all set. One of the questions is, can you repeat the names of the books that you mentioned in the very beginning?
Yes. One is The Sultana Disaster by Jerry Potter.
Okay.
And the other one is Disaster on the Mississippi by Dean Selicker. And you can see I've got this matched up. I have quite a name here. Sorry about that.
No problem. Next question.
Yeah, those are the two books.
Awesome. The next question, I guess, comment that I have is 460 to 2137. That's a huge jump in capacity for the Sultana. It makes you wonder what people were thinking when they made those decisions.
I don't know. When you read the books, the way they describe, people were just crammed in there, literally shoulder to shoulder, back to front, laying down sideways to each other. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. You look at the picture and you can see how they're all just crammed together. And why anyone would think that that would be safe is just mind-boggling, which is one of the reasons I find the whole story amazing.
Kathleen says her one-name study turned up some info on the Sultana disaster too. She's going to check her resources for any information that might help. So there we go.
Yes,
some more, less pajamas, but more pandemic genealogy.
Absolutely.
We're all out of our pajamas today. What databases or sources did you use to find the details about Lucius?
A lot of government records. I started with finding the census, started with the census, and from there, then I started using Fold 3 to find his military records, including his pension file. His pension file contained a lot of information. I did, from his pension file, know his regiment and company, and I was able to find a book, well used, as you can see here. It's the history of the 102nd Regiment OVI. So it's a very detailed book about every step of this regiment, the 102nd, during the Civil War. I even have a cup that I got on the internet. um, so I'm very well versed in the 102nd Regiment of Ohio.
There you go. And then final question. What are your plans for your future research once everything starts to open up?
I'm going to be on a plane,
I
and
think we all are.
yeah, I'm going to be heading to Salt Lake City to check the family history library there. I'm going to be heading to Ohio to the Holmes County Historical Society and Genealogical Society because I believe that they also have some records there. I've been in contact with them over the internet. And I definitely have to get to the National Archives to get the government records, particularly the testimony of the people involved in the Sultana disaster. I also understand that the National Archives does have hospital records
Ooh,
and they are not digitized. So that might be the first place I end up going is Washington, D.C., because I have to get my hands on those hospital records to see if there's any mention as to how he got to St. Louis.
well, the
After
good
my
thing is,
yeah, after my discovery yesterday of this other gentleman who was with Company G of the 102nd and his mention of being sent to Jefferson Barracks, I'm very optimistic that I think Lucius was with him.
hmm,
Doesn't stop me from being obsessed with the Sultana.
no. Well, let's see. Was Lucius buried in Ohio or Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery? George is asking.
He is buried in Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. That last slide I have was an actual slide, a picture of his tombstone.
Well, the good thing is, I think a good route would be flying across the country to Washington, D.C., and then just backtracking your way towards the West Coast again.
Absolutely. That's my plan. I,
Well,
all my other trips got canceled this year, so I have the money. I'm just going to take off and start hitting all the genealogical sites.
I think at least things are going in the fingers crossed right direction. So
Oh, really?
thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up Q&A. We're going to have a little break, and then we'll be back at 10:20 for Doug Whisker's presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.